Welcome all guys to this event of ASM, and as always we will start with some Quran, and our brother will read some rows of Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والسماء والطارق وما أدراك ما الطارق النجم الثاقب إن كل نفس لما عليها حافظ فلينظر الإنسان مما خلق خلق من ماء دافق يخرج من بين الصلب والترائب إنه على رجعه لقادر يوم تبلى السرائر فما له من قوة ولا ناصر والسماء ذات الرجع والأرض ذات الصدع إنه لقول فصل وما هو بالهزل إنهم يكيدون كيدا وأكيد كيدا فمهل الكافرين أمهلهم رويدا صدق الله العظيم.
It's fine. Yes. Okay, sorry guys for this delay. It was just like for a short thing which we bring to our event room. So welcome everyone. Tonight is the last event of this academic year, and my name is Sudin. I'm from team events of ASM Politecnico. So tonight we are organizing a cultural event regarding the Islamic culture here in Italy. And before going to details and description, I think we should initiate our event by without me. So tonight we have, as I said before, tonight is the last event of this academic year. This event is provided and organized by ASM Politecnico. ASM, or Associazione Studenti Musulmani, is one of the Politecnico associations. It is established in 2017, and since then the association tried hard to create and to organize events, cultural, academic, and sport events and conferences to all Politecnico students. Today, our event is entitled, Is it possible for an Islamic culture that can coexist side by side with a Western culture here in Western country, here in Italy? And for this reason, we have the honor to invite an icon of Islamic culture. It is Francesca Bocca. Francesca Bocca is the professor of Arabic culture and the humanitarian scientific Milan, and co-founder of the Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, and the author of the book Nietzsche Paradise that was released in 2022. And we are honored to have you with us tonight, even virtually. And dear Francesca Bocca, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to join you this evening. I'm really happy to be able to talk to a Muslim student association in the Italian university, because I have been attending Italian universities for a very long time. And at the very beginning in 2006, when I first stepped foot inside Italian universities, no such associations were there. So to see such association taking place and to start being born and getting rooted inside universities is wonderful, alhamdulillah. So thank you very much for inviting me. I would like to talk to you about the possibility of an Italian Muslim culture. So why should you be interested in that? After all, we are not speaking in Italian. Most of us are not doing humanistic subjects. So why do we care about Islamic culture, and why should there be Islam in it? What I would like to do is to give you some input, such as at the end of today, inshallah, you would have some insights about it, and you would think that having an indigenous Italian culture is indeed a priority for all Muslims living in Italy and for all Muslims who have anything to do with Italy at large. So first of all, what is culture? Sometimes we tend to think that culture is what is done inside universities. Culture is what is written in books, and culture is what is talked about by people who have a higher education. However, cultural studies have moved on ages since such definitions of culture were the norm. Now consider culture to be absolutely everything, basically. Culture can be the way we perceive time, the type of food we like, the way for us is normal to behave inside a relationship with friends or family. All of this is culture, and all of social ethnic groups that start living in Italy will have by consequence their own little culture, which will be as shared as these groups become more rooted and are wider. Therefore, is there already an Italian Muslim culture by any chance? This is a question which is not particularly easy to answer. Sometimes people who are outside the Muslim community seem to have a quicker answer to that. That is, yes, there is an Islamic culture, such a thing exists, and it is incompatible with our standards of living, with the way we like to do things, with the way it is just and correct and progressive to do things. I believe this is a fundamental and profound mistake. What is an Islamic Italian culture? As for now, I do not believe there is one yet, but we are on the brink of having one. As more Muslims are born into Italian families, convert, travel here, like many of you, inshallah, will do. You just travel here for your studies, and then some of you will find it nice here and will just stay. And inshallah, I hope that is the case for as many of you as possible. Some of you are Italian simply studying, so you're already Italian by culture. And when all of us will have a shared culture, then an Italian Muslim culture will be there. Can we all, people as different as born Muslims, converts, recent immigrants, have a common culture? This is the difficult question. And also, can the West, this very strange construction paradigm that we very often reason by, can it exist alongside this culture? In other words, the Muslims living in Italy, will they have a culture which is Western? Or what is the West? In particular, in Italy, we use this word, which is the Occident. Also in English, sometimes it is used in a bit of older text, which gives the West basically the same geographical connotation, but many times in the press, or even in books sometimes when they're not particularly accurate, the word Occidente, the West, is used in contraposition with Islam, as if there was a land which can be the opposite of a religion. And this false dichotomy has informed and influenced much of the understanding that the Italian layman has about us and our culture. Another aspect which I believe is absolutely crucial in this matter is the fact that we are not present in the cultural world. And now I am using culture in the stricter sense. So meaning the things that are done in universities, but not only universities, in theaters, in art galleries, even online, if the context is like the one we are now, to talk about culture, to make culture, to think in such a way that it is productive of cultural changes, to educate in a deeper way. So how can we start from this knowledge, this consciousness that we are absent from the places of culture and move on to create something? My first advice would be read everything. So read what people write about us and read what we try to write. Read what people write about us. If you find books about Islam, read them, no matter who wrote them, because you will understand the way we are being looked at. And this is one direction of the things. And if you find any book written by a Muslim in the Italian language, read it. Even if it is a translation, even if it is a book which does not have, in your opinion, a very high cultural standard, because that will show you the way the community is looking outside. So when we can create some form of thought, of cultural thought, of course, which incorporates both the way we are being looked at and the way we look at the society around us, then at this point, we have a coherent culture. And this is the first step, because then, of course, what needs to be done is to branch it out. An Italian Muslim culture cannot exist if it is only a culture interested in dawah. And here I'm not saying that dawah is not important for culture. It is absolutely crucial, but a culture must have different ramifications and branches, because culture is the encounter that people have with a specific world, with a specific context in which they are living. So if it is only ideologic, if it is only apologetic, then this culture is really not generative. It stops. And you see many times that, for example, books in the Italian Muslim community, many times are just written, they're printed, sometimes they're gifted, sometimes they're sold, but they do not generate more books. We have lost as Muslims this culture of writing a book and then somebody writes a refutation and then somebody writes a commentary and then somebody summarizes the very first book that we are referring about. All these aspects got lost because it's as if the books we write are sterile. They do not generate more culture. I mean, as Muslims, where are we in the world of contemporary art? We should be the first artists, because we have a religion which prohibits, of course, certain representations of the human and the divine form, and therefore it already directs us towards an abstract mathematical sort of purity, which is so widespread and is so understood as a language in modern and contemporary art. Why didn't we leave a mark in contemporary art? So the same could be asked about poetry, which the ones of you who know me, I see some familiar faces around, know that I am very much attached to this field. Contemporary poetry should be our best field, because ours is a tradition of poets, of people who can use language, of people who have always expressed with the language of allusion the innermost truths of our religion. Yet we see that we are very much lacking in this field. Perhaps this could be because historically here in Italy, we have always been othered. The same way that Islam has been defined Hajarism in certain contexts, the fact that we have been referred to as the Ishmaelites, as the people who come from Ishmael, while the Europeans, the Christians, come from Isaac. This fact already rooted in the biblical text, which shows a conflict here, which is much more rooted than the one in the Quranic text, could be perhaps a first key to understanding this deep-rooted othering that the West and much of Italian culture has done towards the Muslim community in the world of culture. Whenever the Quran has been translated in the Italian language, if you read the history of translations of the Quran in Italian, is a very fascinating history. And you can see that almost all earlier attempts were made to prove Islam wrong, to show that it was a heresy. But when one has such an approach to the holy text of Islam, when one has such an approach at looking at us, of course, it is very difficult that something fruitful comes out of us. A completely different approach was the one shown in the West. So it's possible by Western standards, for example, by Goethe, whose encountering of the Quran was the turning point of his own faith journey and eventually his own conversion and life story with Islam. You all know that it's a topic that I have particularly at heart, one of Goethe's Islamic life, because of my connection with the German language and the German culture. But it is just an example of what a fully Westerner person could do with Islam by making food out of the Islamic experience, cultural food, and then producing something which is innovative, completely new, totally Western, and at the other point, completely Islamic. And this is the experience that Goethe did in the Westdeutscher Divan, which is the East-Westerner Divan, his collection of poetry, where he did several things that are important for the creation of an Islamic identity in the West, and in particular in Italy. So it wasn't a book that was written just because Goethe wanted to prove Islam right. Such ideological approaches usually do not make good art. Good culture is never born by just wanting to prove somebody's right. Otherwise, there would be much more than there actually is. What happened to Goethe is that he had many experiences. The spiritual change of encountering Islam, he fell in love with a woman, he felt lonely in some of his experiences in Weimar, and all these universal experiences of men, when read through the light of this artistic product that he thought particularly resonated inside himself, which is Persian poetry, classical Persian poetry of Hafiz, for example, this generated this beautiful work of art. So as Muslims who have the ambition and perhaps the call to create culture which speaks to the West, we learn a few things from Goethe. The first is that we should not fake being something other than what we are. Goethe never tried to behave like an Arab. The second thing is that only from the most authentic experiences, art is born. Only when there is this thing that Goethe calls the transfiguration of the experiences, really the encounter with Islam creates something new in the person. Another aspect that is very important is that to create something new, to create Italian Islamic culture, one should always be at the forefront of what makes him or her uncomfortable. It is almost impossible to create a new culture, to be at the vanguard of things and doing it comfortably. This is because art requires experimentation, requires showing our vulnerability. And culture is the same, whether you want to write a novel, to write poetry, or just have a great thesis at the end of your studies, you will see that you will get attached to your thesis and you will feel vulnerable because people criticizing it would also almost feel like criticizing a piece of you. And this particular thing that man can really pour himself into his art, into the culture that he tries to transmit. So the potential here is of Islam becoming a food for Western thought, but the same thing has been seen. So the relationship between the West and Islam, that here I'm still perhaps with a provoking attitude, trying to still use as contraries. Well, as you understood, for me, really, they are not. But this contamination between Islam and the West can also happen in the opposite way. And this is the case of, for example, the poetry of Muhammad Iqbal, which was fruitfully inspired by his reading and his understanding, his studies of the works of Friedrich Nietzsche. And you already know, I wrote about it, so it is one of the topics which I find most interesting, this reciprocal contamination of thoughts. And also, I think one of the fields where our work in history, in literary critics, has most potential, because many Muslims dealing with Islamic studies, dealing with literary critic, have taken a path of deconstructing the West. So, for example, well, the most famous of all of them, Edward Said, with his Orientalism. Now it is like you deconstruct the way the West has been talking about Muslims, or you can even deconstruct the West itself, as some more radical critics of Orientalism have done. Well, what I am proposing here is, rather than reconstruct, construct, build something new, create something new, where authenticity is the key word, rather than historical accuracy or the will to destroy something bad that has been done before, something that was harmful to culture, that was harmful to Islam or to thought. Let's not try to subtract from that. So another point that I believe is very fruitful to investigate here is to understand, if we want to create a contemporary Islamic culture in Italy, is to understand what does it mean to be contemporary. Because a contemporary person is just one who lives at the same time of somebody else. And this is a very confusing definition, because how can we do a contemporary culture? Is there any alternative? I mean, we are stuck here in terms of time. There isn't any option to go backwards or forwards faster or slower than we're actually going. So contemporaneity seems to be our only option. There are some interesting studies and interesting writings on the topic of what does it mean to be contemporary. There is this very tiny one in Italian that I was reading by Giorgio Agamben, who's a philosopher which many of you should know. Cos'è il contemporaneo? Which is just a very tiny definition of contemporary in terms of culture. And the way he explains it is that there is this strange relationship, this curious relationship between contemporary culture and its time. It is not completely belonging to the time, something that is a contemporary art or contemporary culture, because in that case, it would just die off. It wouldn't add anything. If something spoke to exactly the time it is written in, then it's just, you know, those bestsellers that come out 1 year and they sell 1 million copies, and then 2 years later they're forgotten and nobody wants to read them anymore, because, or like bad design. If any of you is into graphic designs, I do not know. Like if you look at a website from 2019, it looks so old. It's already gone, that trend. I don't know whether it is blobs, whether it is neon colors. It is over because it spoke too much to something that was already there. And this is the problem with the trends, and culture is not a trend. This should be clear, because if you read the classic, what is a classic? It's something that in a certain way escapes to the destiny of being a contemporary, if you think about it. Why is there a need to translate every generation the Odyssey? Why is there a need to translate every generation poetry, which might be 1,000 years old? This is because it's a classic. It never stops speaking to people. So you just need to update the language, and the message is still true, is still resonating, is still like ringing in the ears of the people who are reading it. And that is what we should be aiming at creating. We want to create something that when Italian Muslims in 500 years, inshallah, read it, they find in it a spark of the truth that they themselves experience as Italian Muslims in 500 years, inshallah. So before doing that, before creating this, we should reflect on what is the relationship between our thought and our specific time. And we should aim at looking beyond us, at trying to, not to predict, because this is not a guessing game to have more audience, but try to see what will remain true. What of those ideas, of those languages, of those rhythms that we feel in our head, I don't know, if we do poetry, of these colors and of these compositions that are in our head, if we do visual arts, ring true, what is destined to set. And as you know, already in theology, Islam is perhaps the religion which looks the most at things who do not set, because of the transcendental reality of the divine. And this has helped, for example, Islamic arts to have common languages within all our history, common visual languages, repetition, replication, geometry, floral decoration, calligraphy. These have stayed true. These have stood up to the test of time, while other languages, other types of art change radically generation from generation. Then if we, and here I am meaning a we, which is constituted of all our specific eyes. So each of us individually, if we have to create a culture that is Islamic, we should not only look at the Islamic component, at the Italian component, but also at the us component. So we should look inside ourselves as well. And how does it change looking inside ourselves if we are Muslims or not? Well, those of you who do scientific subjects might have a look upon yourself, which is very reductionistic at times. I myself have started my studies with very scientific disciplines. I went up to a PhD in neuroscience, and there my conception of myself was really little more than a brain on a stick. And this understanding is not what the Islamic understanding of the self has traditionally been. The Islamic understanding of the self is a complete self. It's not like the Cartesian idea of a completely split existence between what thinks and what does not think, and there is nothing else which can be added. Our understanding of the self is constituted, of course, of our body, but then, of course, also of a spirit. And this spirit has an eternal component, meaning eternal like it doesn't die, not, of course, it has no beginning, because in Islam, there isn't such a thing apart from Allah. But these are not the only two components. So it's not like we are body and the spirit. We have an intellect, and this is a separate component. So the ruh, the spirit, and the aql, they are two different things, the intellect. And the aql is this kind of logical capability, which we do have, but as in Islamic theory, this does not define us in the deeper way. While, as you know, in Western thought, this intellect, this rationality, this logic is really what sets us apart as humans. So from this already, you start thinking that the way we understand the self has an impact in which kind of culture we can create. Because if we're only divided into thinking stuff and non-thinking stuff, you understand that our vision is toned down, is flattened almost. While in the Islamic view, if we were able to revive it, this very long tradition of Islamic psychology, we would be able to revive our own spirit, our own intellect, and our psyche, because there is also the nafs inside ourselves. There is also the heart, the qalb, which is another component, and yet it has function all these things have interactions, and these interactions work in a creative way depending on our state. The lower we are in our spiritual path, the more some components prevail. The higher we are in the spiritual path, the more they lead the way to other components, which become in a certain way leading but never dominant to the level of muting the rest. The Islamic self is a balanced self. And a balanced self will, of course, create a form of art which is different than what the West has created, in particular in one aspect, which is, in fact, the position of the self. The role of the author inside art is a very long topic. But the fact that nowadays artists are like rock stars, artists are people who live a life of absolute protagonism, is something that in an Islamic light is not really likable. We should not aim being under the limelight. We should not aim at doing millions through online art. This is really not what an artist wants to do in an Islamic way, what a culture person who wants to create an Islamic culture in Italy would like to do, to appear in talk shows. This is not interesting. What is interesting is to use these ways of communication, these channels, these modes, arts, poetry, culture, your thesis, your academic articles, your posters, whatever you do also in your studies, to balance your own self. Because at the end of the day, in an Islamic light, creating culture is nothing different than any other job, than any other call that a person has in life. Of course, it is urgent. So it is one of those things that weight on the community. So it is a fard kifaya, meaning that somebody has to do it to help the Muslims in finding an identity. Like somebody needs to help the Muslims having doctors, having people who can do all different types of jobs. And in the same way, we also need people of culture, people who will write things for children, for adults, people who will be able to defend the thought of Islam when it is under attack with such strange positions like the one I have told you at the very beginning. And this will be ultimately for the one who is creating culture and for the one who is following this culture, nothing else than a test from Allah, from which we all hope it will be the way to Jannah. So I'm concluding here with wishing you all that your cultural efforts and that your work at the university, your presence inside the university, will be the first step in the creation of such an Islamic Italian culture, which will eventually be a way for you to collect hasanat and to live a righteous life which will please Allah. Amin. I did not say that at the very beginning, but I am of course available to questions.
Can you hear me, Professor? Professor, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you, Professor, for this speech. We are all privileged and honored, and I think we are all blessed by the description you made. And I think now we can open the part of question and answers, and you are guys more than welcome to ask the professor directly if you have any questions or inquiries about what you said. Thank you. And also for the online guests, you can also ask your questions, please.
Professor, first of all, I don't have any specific question right now, but the presentation and the conference was very informative, and for students like us who are more on the engineering side, I would say it's extremely enlightening, and it also made me personally realize how important it is to get familiarized with art, culture, and specifically subjects such as theology, of course, Islamic theology, but as well as contemporary art and other aspects of this domain. Anyone online or in presence who has questions, online you can probably raise your hand. So inshallah, we'll give the floor to you to speak, or you can even write it in the chat. And in presence, if anyone has any questions, so you can raise your hand.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Professor, for your speech. It was very interesting. And before you say that we have to read about books that talk about Muslims in Islam, and it doesn't matter who wrote them. And I want to ask you if you can suggest us some books to read and to see the point of view of other people or other point of view about Muslims or Islam.
Well, that is the easier part of the reading suggestion link, because usually people ask me what can I read about Islam, and it is okay, both from non-Muslims and from Muslims. And in Italian, the first category takes up like 95%. So wherever you go in a library and you find a book about Islam, most probably it will not be written by a Muslim. Many times it is written by Islamologists who are quite serious in their approach. So it is not like every time you read a book written by non-Muslims, you're gonna find hatred against Muslims. But yet you can always see that there is some defect in the understanding. And this could be based, for example, on the stereotype that Muslims follow a religion of the law, and this law excludes the possibility of talking about theology, of having a complex and articulated theology. So as for suggestions in Italian, the very classics are usually books by Bausani. This is like the opening school of Islamological and Arabistic thought in Italy. His book is L'Islam, simply. But there are really many others. There are books by Ventura, who's also, he's living. He's an Islamologist as well, who particularly talked about Islamic spirituality. There are quite a few basic things you can find. What is more difficult to find is books by Muslim authors, I would say.
I think we have another question by Kisam. So please, can you turn your mic on, and then you can ask the question directly to the professor.
Assalamu alaikum. First of all, thank you so much for this, and I found really many inspirational points. So, and I was actually very excited for this day. So, jazakallah khairan. And I have a question actually, because like I'm a born Moroccan. I would say born Moroccan Italian maybe, because I'm Moroccan, Arab, proud of my heritage. At the same time, I definitely acknowledge that my identity is also Italian. And, you know, many of us, I would say, so people that they have another heritage, but at the same time, they were born or they bring up in another country, many times they found themselves like in the middle, meaning that they really don't find where they belong. They don't understand if they are, okay, I'm Arab, I'm Italian, I'm Western, I'm non-Western, and many times they tend to, how to say, to confuse culture and religion. So sometimes, since they do not, how to say, do not distinguish between religion and culture, they really lose their way. Or sometimes they are biased by the culture, thinking that is actually religion, while it is not. So do you think that this component, this cultural component that sometimes we bring from our parents, is actually representing a drawback to build a identity?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. In my dealings with the Muslim community in Italy, I would say that the absolute majority of my Muslim friends, of course, are second generation Muslims. And what I think is that they have a difficulty in finding their identity, but they are really the starting point of where an Islamic Italian culture can start from, because they have a very strong critical spirit, much more than converts, because they always understand and always try to critically analyze things that are done around them, things that are practiced, and try to distinguish, like, is this things that people just do because they come from Morocco, or is this something that is Islamic? Is it something that I should do? And to grow up with this preoccupation really makes you sharper in many ways. So I believe that, I mean, I do not want to delve into the topic of whether one can grow up in a place and not belong there, because I really think that there is no other choice. If you grew up here, I mean, things done somewhere else are just weird, so it is not your culture. I know many friends who are from Moroccan heritage, and when they go to Morocco, it doesn't feel like so much like home. So of course it's a heritage, of course it's perhaps even a dual culture, but the primary culture, the state of the matter culture, let's say, is here. And so this critical spirit, I think, can be definitely a very helpful tool in creating an Italian Muslim culture. At the same time, of course, it's something that I think one has to pay a high price for in terms of difficulty and identity struggles and so on and so forth. May Allah protect all of you.
Jazakallah khairan. Thank you very much.
حياك.
Someone will hear me?
Yes.
Sometimes I meet people who have a mixed background between their origins and their the place of what they live, Occidental place. So the problem is that some people tend to have to have their identity more Occidental than their Islamic origin. So how could someone help these people to come back to their path, I mean the Islamic path? Because sometimes the Occidental way of thinking tends to repel the religious ways of thinking. So we should try to find another way to talk with those people. So do you have any suggestion about that? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, I think that in our context, many times issues that look like issues of faith are actually something else. So there are many people who are struggling with, for example, self-esteem, with their own identity, even with past traumas. It would look like their problem is primarily not wanting to follow the religion anymore, but it is actually a sort of rebellion towards their specific family that they have been brought up by, or from rejection that has happened to them by their peers because of their cultural background. It could be many reasons, but I believe that in general we should work on the prevention of this phenomenon, because working on it after it has happened, it is really difficult. And the first work we could do is to change this idea that either you're good Muslims or you are Western. And this is the way that for some reason it has some base, this idea, and it developed especially in the Arab world after colonization. So where there wasn't a single person who was Westerner and Muslim. So of course these things contradicted each other. But nowadays we should not make the same mistake. We should absolutely give people space and representation in the community, depending on their heritage and on the way they feel comfortable expressing this culture, because there can be, as I will not stress enough, a culture that is Islamic in the practices, not, I mean, abstractly Islamic, like praying Salah and fasting Ramadan and reading Quran, and at the same time, it can use the language, the forms of art, the way of expressing of Western culture. These two things are not in contradiction with each other. And it's the same way that there have been practicing Muslims in the Persian world, in the Turkish world, which things that now we give for granted, but Islam has always been able to encounter cultures and to give them new life. And so what we could do is to try to avoid people feeling split in half inside their cultural belonging. Like you can have the religion here and your culture there. And this is harmful to everybody, because it feels like, okay, you are one thing when you pray, and then you're another thing when you're out in the streets. And this is a very toxic belief, because you never feel conscious, connected, balanced, which is the nature itself of what the Islamic self should be.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Would you say, do we have time for one more question?
Yes, one more is perfect. Then I also have to go ahead. I thank you very much, but one more is very fine.
Is there anyone who has a question? Because I have one. Okay, so since no one is volunteering, so Professor, it's a follow-up question to what the answer you just stated about finding because there's a fine line between people transcending from culture to religion or religion to culture and getting mixed up about what to follow. So, like coming from Pakistan, which is a Muslim predominant country. We also tend to have that problem over there. Although, like as I stated before, it's already a Muslim predominant country, but the trends now about how things are going is in Pakistan. Western culture is quite, you could say, evolving, or is being dominant over there as well, and and religion is being compromised in many areas across our countries. So how would you recommend as daily practices, what could a Muslim or a teenager or someone like us in their 20s who is about to start a family or looking for about to start their careers, how can they approach this problem by probably enacting some daily habits that could help this problem, to find a solution to this problem. Thank you.
Thank you. One suggestion would be to work on openness inside the family. And this is because since we still do not have this actual culture that could be both Western and Muslim, then we need to make sure that people are being able to express culturally their feelings without having to compromise on their religion. So many times as Muslims, we get very defensive, and rightfully so when we are talking about religion. But sometimes we also get defensive when we see people, for example, having new interests. Many times I know, for example, of many people who have an interest in art. And the first thing that their family tell them is, okay, but watch it because it's a bad environment, and also it's haram to draw people, and they're not good people, and none of them is Muslim, and so on and so forth. Well, perhaps what these people wanted to do was calligraphy. And I mean, we get so strict that people feel like they can't even breathe anymore, and then they get away from their religion itself. So being open, not having our first reaction judgment. So first we try to understand the things very much in depth before expressing a judgment, not being always so startled by things to have an angry reaction, which sometimes can also happen, and try to work in our head into this wrong differentiation between the West and Islam. And one place I do not know if, because I know there are families in Pakistan who like Iqbal, most of them, and who read it, and some who don't do that so much. But if yours is a family that reads Iqbal, then the Javedname, which I know I don't pronounce very well, but that book, which is a travel through heaven, basically, in which Iqbal meets great figures of the past, and some of them are Western and some of them are not, and yet they all teach him something. And I think this is what really makes Iqbal great, this understanding that culturally everybody can teach you something. So this gives you a completely different new approach, new attitude towards new things, perhaps. I hope I could answer your question.
Thank you very much, yes, Professor. Those were pretty detailed and so putting a full stop or probably a comma to this night, and maybe hoping to see you in a future event with ASM next year, inshallah. We thank you very much, and apologies for the delay in the beginning again. Our association is growing step by step, and we learn from our mistakes. So I hope.
Thank you all very much. It was really an honor to be here with you this evening. Thank you again.
It was an honor for us, Professor. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum to all of you.
Wa alaikum salam.